She had exactly $20 to her name and 3 days to pay her rent. By sunset, she was broke, and by midnight, she was a millionaire. But the most shocking part wasn't the money. It was the man who had been watching her from the shadows the entire time. The city of Oakhaven didn't care if you were hungry. To the thousands of people rushing past the corner of 5th and Main, the elderly man huddled against the freezing brick wall was just part of the architecture, a smudge on a polished landscape. Leora Bennett was the only one who stopped. Her fingers brushed the crumpled $20 bill in her pocket, the only thing standing between her and an eviction notice. She looked at the man, Harold, whose eyes held a depth of exhaustion that mirrored her own. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Logic told her to walk away, to save herself, but her hand moved on its own. As she pressed the warm bill into Harold's trembling palm, she felt a strange prickle on the back of her neck. Across the street, shielded by the tinted glass of a parked black sedan, Alexander Kingsley watched the transaction through a long-range lens. He didn't look like a man watching a random act of kindness. He looked like a hunter who had finally found his prize. "Target confirmed," Alexander whispered into his lapel mic. "Initiate the transition. Let's see if she stays this kind when everything she owns starts to disappear." The fluorescent lights of the greasy spoon hummed with a headache-inducing buzz as Leora wiped down the final, oil-slicked table of the night. Her back ached, a dull throb radiating from her spine to her heels, but her mind was preoccupied with a different kind of pain, the cold mathematics of survival. She pulled a small, tattered envelope from her apron and dumped its contents onto the laminate surface. 5 ones, a handful of sticky quarters, and the Holy Grail, a single, crisp $20 bill she had tucked away earlier that morning. She counted it once, then twice, hoping the numbers would somehow grow under the dim light. Total, $64. "Is that it?" she whispered to the empty diner. She needed 300 more by Friday, or the landlord, a man with a heart like a flint stone, would change the locks. Leora stared at the $20 bill. It was more than just paper. It was 2 days of groceries, a bus pass, or a tiny fraction of her dignity. She folded it tightly, sliding it into her pocket as she clocked out and stepped into the biting autumn wind. The city of Oakhaven was a cathedral of glass and steel that had no pews for the poor. As Leora hurried toward the subway, her breath blooming in white puffs, she saw him. Harold was slumped in the alcove of a closed department store, his thin coat offering about as much protection as a paper bag. He wasn't begging. He wasn't even holding a cup anymore. He simply sat with his head bowed, his fingers blue-tinged and trembling as they gripped the handles of a walker that had seen better decades. Leora tried to look away. She told herself she was one bad day away from sitting beside him. She told herself that $20 was her lifeline. But as she drew closer, she saw a single tear track through the grime on his cheek, freezing before it could fall. She stopped. The world around them blurred. The commuters rushing home, the screech of distant tires, the muffled music from passing cars. In that moment, the $20 felt heavy, like lead in her pocket. It was a choice between her own crumbling safety and a stranger's immediate suffering. She reached into her pocket, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew the cost of what she was about to do, but as Harold's eyes met hers, hollow, pleading, and utterly defeated, the smart choice felt like a death sentence for her soul. The cold wasn't just in the air. It was a living thing, biting through Leora's thin jacket and settling deep into her bones. Every step away from the diner felt heavier than the last. Her internal monologue was a frantic, circular debate that she couldn't silence. "I'm crazy," she thought, her fingers twitching against the bill in her pocket. "That money is my electricity. It's my dinner. It's the only reason I won't be sleeping on a park bench next week." She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that someone else, someone with a warmer coat or a full bank account, would surely stop. But she knew this city. She had watched people step over Harold for hours like he was nothing more than a crack in the sidewalk. She reached the mouth of the alley where the shadows seemed to swallow the light of the street lamps. Harold looked smaller than he had 10 minutes ago, his shivering so violent it made the metal of his walker rattle. The sound was rhythmic and haunting, like a ticking clock counting down to the end of a life. Leora stopped. The logic of the world screamed at her to keep walking, to be smart, to be practical. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a beggar. She saw a human being whose fire was going out. If she walked away, She wasn't just saving $20. She was losing her soul. She stepped into the darkness of the alcove, the scent of damp concrete and old rain filling her lungs. "Sir?" she said softly, her voice trembling as much as her hands. She reached out and pressed the bill into his palm. It was a tiny piece of paper, but it felt like she was handing him her very heart. Harold's fingers closed around the money with a slow, agonizing stiffness. He looked up, and for a moment, the grime and the age seemed to vanish from his eyes, replaced by a clarity that was terrifyingly sharp. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. The heat of his breath was the only warm thing in the alley. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer a blessing. Instead, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength, his voice a rasping, ghostly silver. "Run, Leora," he whispered, the sound of her name hitting her like a physical blow. "Don't go home tonight. The locks have already been changed, and the shepherd is counting his sheep." Leora froze, the blood draining from her face. She had never told this man her name. She had never even seen him before tonight. As she pulled her hand away, stumbling back into the light of the street, the elderly man sank back into the shadows, his eyes still fixed on her with a warning that felt like a curse. Behind her, the engine of a black sedan purred to life, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. Leora didn't wait to see who was driving. She turned and ran, the chilling echo of her own name ringing in her ears. The interior of the black sedan was a fortress of silence, insulated from the howling wind and the rhythmic clatter of the city's indifferent masses. Alexander Kingsley sat in the rear, the cool, blue glow of a tablet illuminating the sharp angles of a face that had graced 100 magazine covers. To the world, he was the architect of the digital age, a man who saw the future in lines of code. But tonight, his eyes weren't fixed on stock tickers or quarterly projections. They were fixed on a grainy, high-definition feed of an alleyway. He watched the girl, Leora, on the monitor. He saw the moment her hand hovered over her pocket, the visible tremor in her shoulders, and the agonizing internal war written across her face. He had watched 74 people pass Harold today. He had watched a businessman in a $4,000 suit scoff at the old man, and a socialite pull her skirt away as if poverty were contagious. Then came Leora. When she pressed the $20 bill into Harold's hand, Alexander didn't cheer. He didn't even smile. He simply exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He leaned forward, tapping a button on the console to zoom in on her face. The raw, unshielded empathy in her eyes was a currency he hadn't seen in the wild for years. "Target confirmed," Alexander whispered, his voice like velvet over gravel. In the front seat, a man in a crisp suit adjusted his earpiece without turning around. "You're sure, sir?" "She's a waitress with a credit score in the basement and a landlord who's filing for her eviction as we speak. She's insignificant." "Insignificant people are the only ones who can afford to be honest, Marcus," Alexander replied, his gaze never leaving the screen as Leora turned and vanished into the gloom. "The rest of us are too busy protecting what we've stolen. I want a full profile. I want to know what she eats, who she loves, and exactly how many cents are left in her bank account now that she's given away her last hope. Find out everything. If she's as pure as she looks, she's the only one who can survive what's coming." Marcus began typing rapidly. "The board is going to ask questions, Alexander. They think the Social Integrity Initiative is a PR stunt. If they find out you're betting the entire Kingsley legacy on a girl who can't even pay her rent." "Let them ask," Alexander cut him off, his eyes darkening as he stared at a heavy, locked briefcase on the seat beside him. It wasn't just money he was looking to give away. It was a burden he could no longer carry alone. He looked back at the screen, watching the empty space where Leora had stood, his knuckles whitening. He was desperate, a man drowning in a sea of greed, searching for a single person who wouldn't let go of the rope. Because if Leora Bennett wasn't the saint he hoped she was, then the clock in his briefcase would keep ticking, and the city of Oakhaven wouldn't just be cold. It would be gone. The adrenaline that had carried Leora away from the alley began to sour into a cold, sinking dread as she reached the third-floor landing of her apartment building. The hallway smelled of stale cabbage and floor wax, a scent she usually found comforting in its familiarity. But tonight the air felt thin and hostile. She reached for her keys, her fingers still numb from the autumn wind, but stopped mid-motion. Slapped across the center of her door, right over the peeling paint, was a neon-red sheet of paper. It screamed in bold block letters, "Notice to vacate." Leora's heart didn't just drop. It seemed to stop entirely. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, the rough edges of the notice scraping against her skin. She didn't need to read the fine print to know what it said. Mr. Henderson, a man whose kindness was as sparse as the heat in the building, had finally followed through on his threat. He hadn't even waited for the Friday deadline. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and stepped into the silence of her studio apartment. She didn't turn on the lights. She couldn't bear to see the meager life she was about to lose. The thrift store armchair, the chipped mugs, the photos of parents who were no longer around to help. She slumped onto the floor, her back against the door, and let the darkness swallow her. The silence was a vacuum, filling up with the echoing voices of her own regret. What was I thinking? She screamed internally. The image of Harold's face, once a source of pity, now felt like a taunt. She had handed over her survival for a moment of sentiment. She had played the hero while her own house was burning down. Now she had no rent, no food, and no roof. She gripped her knees to her chest, the hollow ache in her stomach growing until it was a physical pain. Every logical instinct she possessed told her she had made a catastrophic mistake. Kindness, she realized in the bitter gloom, was a luxury for people who didn't live on the third floor of a crumbling tenement. She checked her phone. The cracked screen showed the time, 10:58 p.m. In 2 minutes, it would be the start of a tomorrow she wasn't prepared for. She closed her eyes, trying to pray, trying to find some shred of the peace she felt when she gave the money away. But all she felt was the terrifying weight of the void. Then the silence shattered. 3 heavy, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the door behind her, so powerful they rattled her teeth. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a neighbor or the official rap of the police. It was slow, deliberate, and carried an authority that made the hair on her arms stand up. Leora scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her breath hitching in her throat. Her landlord never came by this late, and he certainly never knocked with that kind of weight. She stared at the door, the red eviction notice casting a faint, crimson shadow in the moonlight filtering through the window. The knocking stopped, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like the floor was falling away. Then a voice low and calm drifted through the wood. "Leora Bennett, open the door. We're behind schedule." Leora pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a cry, her heart thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The voice outside was too polished, too cold for this neighborhood. It lacked the jagged edge of the city. She stayed frozen on the floor, the shadows of her sparse furniture stretching toward her like reaching fingers. If she didn't answer, perhaps they would think the apartment was already abandoned. Perhaps the darkness would keep her secret. "I know you're sitting against the door, Leora," the voice continued, unwavering. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm simply a messenger." A sliver of curiosity fought through her terror. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and peered through the rusted peephole. In the dim, flickering light of the hallway stood a man who looked like he belonged in a skyscraper, not a tenement. He wore a sharp, charcoal-gray suit and leather gloves, and he held a heavy, matte-black envelope in his hand. He didn't look like a debt collector. He looked like an omen. Leora unlatched the chain with trembling fingers and cracked the door just an inch. The man didn't try to push his way in. He merely extended the envelope, his expression as unreadable as a stone carving. "From a benefactor," he said. "I don't have a benefactor," Leora whispered, her voice cracking. "I have an eviction notice. The two are more related than you think." He placed the envelope in her hand. The paper felt thick, expensive, and strangely heavy. "I suggest you look inside before you pack your bags." Without another word, the man turned and walked down the hallway, his footsteps silent on the grimy carpet. Leora closed the door and locked it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She slumped back onto the floor, the black envelope resting in her lap like a live wire. With a jagged breath, she tore the seal. There was no money inside, no check to pay her rent, no letter of explanation. Instead, her fingers pulled out a single, glossy photograph. Leora's blood turned to ice. The photo was high resolution, captured with a professional clarity that felt invasive. It showed the alleyway from earlier that night. There she was, frozen in time, her hand extended toward Harold. The lighting was cinematic, catching the exact moment the $20 bill left her fingertips and touched his palm. Her face was visible, raw, tear-streaked, and beautiful in its desperation. She flipped the photo over. On the back, written in elegant, sharp calligraphy, were 5 words. "We saw what you sacrificed." A cold shiver raced down her spine, and she crawled toward the window, pulling the moth-eaten curtain back just a fraction. Down on the street, the black sedan she had noticed earlier was still there, idling silently. A man stood beside it, looking up at her third-story window. Even from this distance, she could feel his gaze, observant, predatory, and calculated. She dropped the curtain, her mind reeling. The act of kindness she thought was a private moment of soul-crushing sacrifice had been a performance for an invisible audience, who had been waiting in the dark with a camera. Why was her life being documented by men in silk suits while she starved? The realization hit her with a sickening thud. She wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted for her own heart. The fear that should have kept Leora locked inside was overridden by a jagged, desperate need for answers. If her life was being dismantled like a stage set, she had to know who was pulling the levers. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't even grab her scarf. She simply shoved the black envelope into her waistband and bolted down the stairs, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The night air felt sharper now, smelling of wet asphalt and impending snow. She ran toward the alley, her sneakers splashing through oily puddles, her eyes searching for the familiar slumped silhouette of the man she had sacrificed her future for. But as she rounded the corner into the alcove, her breath hitched. The space was empty. The department store alcove where Harold had sat for days, where he had shivered and wept, was unnaturally clean. There was no tattered blanket, no rusted walker, no discarded coffee cups. It was as if he had been erased from the map of the city. Leora stood in the center of the void, her chest heaving. The silence of the alley felt heavy and artificial, a stark contrast to the chaotic warning Harold had whispered only hours before. "Harold," she called out, her voice small and brittle. Only the wind answered, whistling through the gaps in the brickwork. She began to pace the small square of concrete, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign that he had ever existed. Perhaps he had been moved by the police, or perhaps he had found shelter. But the memory of his hand on her wrist, the strength that shouldn't have been there, suggested something far more calculated. Near the back of the alcove, tucked into a crack in the pavement where the shadows were thickest, something glinted. Leora knelt, her fingers brushing against the cold, slick mud. She pulled out a small metallic object, no larger than a kidney bean. It wasn't a piece of jewelry or a discarded button. It was a high-tech, flesh-toned earpiece, sleek and expensive, with a tiny blue light that pulsed once, like a dying heartbeat, before going dark. She held it in her palm, her skin crawling. This wasn't the trash of a homeless man. This was the equipment of a professional. The weight of the realization hit her like a physical blow. The beggar, who had looked at her with such hollow, pleading eyes. The man who had taken her last $20 while she cried, had been wearing a wire. Every word she had spoken, every sob she had stifled, and the very act of her charity had been transmitted to someone else. Harold wasn't a victim of the streets. He was a participant in a game she didn't know she was playing. Leora stood up, clutching the device so hard its edges dug into her skin. A terrifying question began to take root in her mind. Was the man she helped ever in need at all, or was he a spy sent to lure her into this trap? As the realization settled, a low, electronic hum began to vibrate from the earpiece in her hand. A voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, crackled through the tiny speaker, though there was no one around to hear it but her. Extraction complete. Subject is in position. Move to phase 2. Leora dropped the earpiece into the mud as if it had burned her. The hum of the city seemed to amplify, the shadows of the alleyway stretching into long, accusing fingers. She turned to flee, but a pair of blinding LED headlights cut through the gloom, pinning her against the brick wall. A matte black SUV rolled silently into the alley, its engine a low, predatory growl that vibrated in her chest. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, draped in a coat that cost more than Leora made in a year, his presence radiating a gravitational pull that made the air feel heavy. It was the man from the sedan, Alexander Kingsley. "The earpiece was a gift from my engineering team," Alexander said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Though I imagine it's a bit overwhelming for someone who just wanted to buy an old man a sandwich." "Who are you?" Leora demanded, her voice trembling despite her effort to stand tall. "Where is Harold? What did you do to him?" Alexander took a slow step toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. "Harold is currently in the back of a heated limousine, sipping 30-year-old scotch. He is my father, Leora." and for one day every year, he returns to these streets to see if the city still has a pulse. Usually it's flatlined. But tonight you gave it a heartbeat. Leora's head spun. The sacrifice, the tears, the crushing weight of her missing rent. It had all been a play. A test? She whispered, a sharp spark of anger piercing her fear. You put me through hell for a family tradition? I'm losing my home because of that $20. You aren't losing anything, Alexander said, his expression shifting from neutral to something somber, almost grim. The test wasn't just for our foundation. It was a search for someone with enough integrity to handle the truth I'm about to tell you. You think your landlord, Mr. Henderson, is just a greedy old man? He's a front, Leora. He works for a syndicate that uses dilapidated buildings like yours to launder more than just money. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. The reason your eviction notice came early isn't because you were short on rent. It's because they found out you saw something you weren't supposed to see at the diner last night. They want you out of that apartment because they can't afford witnesses, and they don't plan on letting you leave the city. Leora felt the world tilt. The red notice on her door wasn't an end. It was a target. You didn't just pass a test, Leora, Alexander whispered, leaning in so only she could hear. You unknowingly walked into a war. And right now, the people who signed that notice are already on their way to your door to make sure you never speak again. The transformation was jarring. Within an hour, Leora had been swept from the mud of the alley into a world of blinding crystal and suffocating silk. Dressed in a gown that felt like a shimmering second skin, she stood at the edge of a ballroom that glowed with the false warmth of 1,000 candles. Beside her, Alexander Kingsley was a silhouette of sharp tailoring and cold intent. He didn't look at the champagne or the celebrities. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the hall, where a man stood surrounded by a circle of laughing sycophants. There he is, Alexander murmured, his voice barely audible over the orchestral swell. Victor Henderson, the man who signed your eviction, and the man who manages the shadow accounts for the Oakhaven Syndicate. Leora felt a cold sweat break beneath her pearls. Henderson didn't look like the disgruntled landlord who grumbled about leaky pipes. Here, under the gilded ceilings of the Metropolitan Gala, he was a titan of industry, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. The plan was simple. Alexander would take the stage to announce a new urban development initiative, and Leora would step forward to testify about the living conditions and the illegal surveillance she had discovered, a move that would trigger a federal audit Alexander had already prepared. Just tell them what you told me, Alexander encouraged, his hand steadying her elbow. Your truth is the only weapon he can't buy. As they moved through the crowd, the sea of elite guests parted. Henderson turned, a wide, practiced smile on his face that died the second his eyes landed on Leora. The recognition was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a dark, mottled rage that made his features twist into something monstrous. He didn't wait for Alexander to speak. He stepped forward, closing the distance until the scent of his expensive cologne felt like a chokehold. He leaned in, ignoring Alexander entirely, his gaze boring into Leora with the heat of a branding iron. You think you're safe because you found a billionaire to play dress-up with? Henderson hissed, his voice a low, vibrating venom. I know exactly where you sleep, Leora. And I know about the accident your parents had 3 years ago. If you breathe a single word on that stage, you won't just be homeless. You'll be a memory. I'll burn everything you ever loved until there isn't even ash left to bury. He pulled back, his smile returning as he patted her cheek with a hand that felt like a snake's belly. Leora felt the ballroom begin to spin, the weight of his threat crushing the air from her lungs as she realized that the monster she was trying to slay already had its claws around her throat. The silence that followed Henderson's threat was deafening, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. Leora looked at the man who had held her life in a stranglehold of fear, and then she looked at Alexander, whose hand was a firm, unshakable weight on her arm. In that moment, the $20 bill she had given away felt like the smallest sacrifice she would ever make. She realized that Henderson wasn't powerful. He was terrified of a girl who had nothing left to lose. Leora didn't blink. She stepped onto the podium, the bright lights of the gala washing over her like a cleansing fire. She didn't read from a script. She spoke about the cold alley, the red notice on her door, and the accidents that happened to people who dared to be kind. As her voice rang through the hall, the police, quietly summoned by Alexander's team, moved in. The shock wasn't just Henderson's public arrest. It was the immediate collapse of a multi-million-dollar web of corruption that had bled Oakhaven dry for decades. Weeks later, the dust of the scandal had settled, leaving a transformed landscape in its wake. Leora stood on the rooftop of the very building she had almost been evicted from. The red notice was gone, replaced by a plaque that read the Bennett Foundation. Alexander stepped out onto the gravel roof, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Harold, no longer the shivering figure in the alley, but a man restored to his dignity in a warm wool coat and a sharp silver tie. Harold reached out, taking Leora's hand and squeezing it with the same strength he had shown in the shadows. "You saved more than just an old man that night, Leora," Harold said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a resonant baritone. "You saved the soul of this family." Alexander handed her a heavy brass key and a leather-bound ledger. "The building is in your name now. All of them are. And the endowment is ready. $10 million to ensure that no one in Oakhaven ever has to choose between their rent and their humanity again." Leora looked down at the keys, then out at the sprawling city below. The lights of Oakhaven twinkled like a fallen galaxy, no longer cold and predatory, but full of potential. She was no longer the girl holding her last $20 in a freezing rain. She was the architect of a new dawn. Beside her, the billionaire and the former beggar stood as equals. Three survivors watching the sun begin to rise over a city they were finally going to change.